Hi.
When I asked him to massage my shoulders, it was supposed to be a simple favor, the kind of innocent request a woman makes when her back aches after a long day. His hands trembled at first, and I told myself it was just because he wasn't used to touching anyone like that. But then his fingers pressed a little deeper, and the warmth of his skin against mine felt different, heavier, almost hesitant. I tried to distract myself, to think about the grocery list, the laundry I hadn't folded, anything but the way my breath caught. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake, one that would change everything in my life, though I didn't know it then. And it all began on that evening, with that first touch, and the silence between us that was louder than any words. Before I tell you how it all happened, leave a comment below and answer this: have you ever asked for something small and innocent, only to watch it spiral into something you could never take back? The day started like any other, the same routine that had become the rhythm of my life. The soft hum of the coffee maker, the sound of the rain tapping against the windows, the familiar quiet of a house that felt too big most days. My husband had left early for another business trip, his suitcase wheeled out the door before the sun had even risen, his goodbye kiss more like a habit than an act of affection. I watched the tail lights of his car disappear down the driveway, and for a moment, I stood there longer than necessary, as if waiting for something to pull me back inside. I walked through the house, the rooms dimly lit with the gray light of an overcast morning. The framed photos on the hallway wall, weddings, vacations, birthdays, all seemed to stare back at me with a quiet accusation. We were smiling in every single one, but those smiles felt like relics of another time. It wasn't that our marriage was bad, there were no screaming fights, no slammed doors, but the warmth had thinned over the years, like an old sweater worn too often. I could still remember the way he used to brush my hair back when we were young, how his fingers would trace the line of my jaw just because he wanted to. Now his hands were almost always on his phone, on his laptop, on a steering wheel headed somewhere else. The house wasn't empty that weekend, though. My stepson, no, that wasn't the right word anymore, he was my husband's nephew, but over the years stepnephew had become the label we used, though none of us said it out loud, was staying over. He was older now, not a boy anymore, but not entirely a man either. There was a kindness to him, something soft in the way he asked if I needed help carrying the bags from the car or reaching the top shelf in the pantry. It was the kind of attentiveness that made me notice the difference between him and my husband, even though I told myself not to think about it. That morning, he offered to help around the house. He fixed a crooked picture frame in the hallway, helped me move a box of old books that had been sitting untouched in the garage. There was nothing unusual in it, nothing that anyone else would notice, but for me, every gesture felt oddly significant. Maybe because it had been so long since anyone looked at me like that, with genuine attentiveness, like I was worth their time. I told myself I was just tired when I felt that tug in my chest. Tired from the rain, from the weight of the week, from the little ache between my shoulder blades that had been bothering me for days. It was nothing, I thought. Just one of those minor discomforts that come with age. By late afternoon, I was in the kitchen making tea when the ache became too much to ignore. I reached for the cupboard, and the sharp pull in my back made me wince. He noticed instantly, asking if I was okay, his voice carrying a mix of concern and hesitation. "I'm fine," I said, pressing my palm to the spot. "It's just my back acting up again." He stood there for a moment, his brow furrowed, like he was weighing whether to speak. Then he offered, almost shyly, I could try to help. "You know, massage it a little. If you want." I laughed lightly, too quickly, trying to dismiss the strange heat that flushed my cheeks. "You don't have to do that." But he didn't step back. "I don't mind," he said, quieter this time. I hesitated. It was an innocent offer, wasn't it? A massage. People ask for those all the time. Married couples, friends, family. But as I stood there, rubbing my own sore shoulder, something inside me faltered. I wanted to say no. I should have said no. Instead, I nodded. We moved into the living room. The light was dimmer there, the kind of soft glow that made shadows pool in the corners of the room. I sat on the edge of the couch, feeling strangely self-conscious as he stood behind me, awkwardly shifting his weight like he wasn't sure where to begin. His hands hovered for a second before they touched me. The first press of his fingers was tentative, almost apologetic, like he was afraid to hurt me. I told myself to relax, to think of it as nothing more than what it was, just hands on my shoulders, easing out the knots. But the warmth of his palms seeped into my skin in a way I hadn't expected. "Like this?" he asked softly. I nodded, though my throat felt tight. He pressed a little deeper, his movements slow, deliberate. The ache in my back eased slightly, but another kind of tension rose in its place, the kind I didn't want to name. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the rain against the window, the steady rhythm of it filling the silence between us. I thought of my husband, where he was, what he was doing, and for a fleeting second, I wondered if he'd even think about me in this moment. There was nothing improper in what was happening, not yet. But the air felt different now, thicker somehow. Each time his fingers moved across my shoulder blades, I felt an odd flutter low in my stomach. I shifted slightly, unsure if I was trying to ease my discomfort or lean into it. "Am I pressing too hard?" he asked. "No," I said, too quickly. "It's fine." But it wasn't fine. It was too much. Too close. Too something. I stayed still, my breath shallow, as his hands moved in slow circles. The seconds stretched out, long and thin, until I wasn't sure if I wanted him to stop or to keep going. Later, I would tell myself it was nothing. That it started as nothing, at least. But even then, I think I knew better. Because something shifted in that room, in those moments, and there was no way to shift it back. The rain didn't let up the next morning. It was the kind of relentless drizzle that made the world outside the windows look blurred and half-formed, as though everything beyond the house had been washed into watercolor. Inside, the air carried that faint smell of dampness, the kind that seeps in even when the doors are closed. I moved through the house slowly, feeling the ache in my back lingering from the day before, but it wasn't just the physical strain that weighed on me. It was the memory of his hands on my shoulders, tentative but deliberate, and the silence that followed after he stopped. I told myself it had been innocent. I repeated it like a mantra as I washed the dishes, as I folded the laundry, as I sat at the kitchen table staring at the rain-slicked yard. But the truth lingered in the way I couldn't meet his eyes when he came into the room that morning. I busied myself with little tasks, wiping a counter that was already clean, rearranging the fruit bowl, all to avoid looking directly at him. He didn't press. He moved through the rooms quietly, but his presence filled the space. At one point, he carried in a basket of firewood, his shirt damp from stepping outside. The sight made my breath catch for reasons I didn't want to acknowledge. He set the wood down, nodded to me as if to ask if I needed anything else, and I mumbled a thank you without looking up. The hours passed in fragments. A kettle whistling. The clink of a spoon against a cup. The muted sound of the TV in the next room, though neither of us seemed to be watching. I felt suspended, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for someone to say something that would release the tension threading between us. By the afternoon, the ache in my back returned, sharper this time, as though my own body was betraying me. I sat on the edge of the couch, pressing my palm into the sore spot. He noticed immediately, his voice low when he asked if I was all right. I nodded too quickly, dismissively, but the truth slipped out anyway. "It's just my back again," I admitted, almost more to myself than to him. There was a pause, long enough for me to hear the rain tapping against the glass like a clock ticking too loudly. Then, softly, he said, "I could try again. If you want." I should have said no. I knew that. 1,000 reasonable excuses flitted through my head, that it wasn't necessary, that I'd manage, that it didn't feel right. But instead, I heard myself say yes. We moved to the same spot as before, the living room still dim, shadows stretched long across the walls. I sat, trying to keep my posture neutral, telling myself this was nothing more than a gesture of help. But even as I thought it, I knew I didn't believe it anymore. His hands hovered for a moment before resting on my shoulders. The first touch was lighter this time, almost careful, but then his fingers pressed deeper, finding the places where tension lived. I focused on the rhythm of his movements, the way his palms warmed my skin through the thin fabric of my shirt. The rain outside grew heavier, a steady hum that blurred into the background. Every so often, he'd ask quietly, "Is this okay?" and I'd nod, unable to trust my voice. But with every minute that passed, something shifted. The line between comfort and something more began to blur. His hands, though careful, lingered a fraction longer than they needed to, and my body betrayed me by responding, not in any overt way, but in the way my breath deepened, in the way my muscles tensed under his touch before yielding. I stared straight ahead, fixing my gaze on the edge of the coffee table, as if holding my eyes steady would hold the moment in check. But it didn't. The silence between us thickened, and my thoughts tangled in it, messy and insistent. I thought of my husband. I thought of the years we'd been together, the way he used to notice every little thing about me, and how that had faded into a routine so familiar it was almost invisible. I thought of the way I'd stopped expecting that kind of attention, how I'd told myself I didn't need it anymore. And now, here it was, from someone I hadn't expected, someone who shouldn't have been the one to give it. I felt the breath leave me, sharp and quiet, when his hands stilled for just a second on my shoulders. He didn't move them away, and I didn't lean forward to break the contact. The pause stretched, long enough to feel like a question neither of us wanted to ask out loud. I turned my head slightly, not even thinking about it, and suddenly we weren't just in that position anymore, me seated, him standing behind. He shifted closer, enough that I could sense his hesitation in the way his breath caught. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it didn't matter. All I know is that we leaned toward each other, and the room seemed to fold in on itself, and we kissed. It was brief, almost hesitant, but it shattered the thin boundary we had been pretending existed. We pulled apart almost immediately, the sound of the rain suddenly too loud, the space between us too sharp. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say. I sat there, my hands gripping my knees, staring down at the floor as if the right words might be written in the grain of the wood. He stepped back, his hands falling to his sides, and for a moment, I thought he might leave the room without looking back. But he didn't. He lingered in the doorway, glancing at me once, then away again. And then he was gone, his footsteps soft on the stairs, leaving me alone with the echo of what we'd done. I stayed there for a long time, the kiss still burning in my mind. The rain hadn't stopped. Neither had the ache in my back. But the ache inside me was something entirely different now. The house felt different after that kiss, though nothing in it had changed. The same rain-soaked windows, the same creak in the stairs, the same photos staring down from the hallway walls, yet everything felt heavier, as though even the furniture now carried the weight of what had happened. I woke up the next morning with that moment looping in my mind, the brief press of lips, the heat of his nearness, and the abrupt silence afterward. Sleep hadn't come easily. I'd lain awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how quickly a single moment can shift the ground beneath you. I moved through the kitchen slowly that morning, the sound of the kettle filling the empty space. Every movement felt exaggerated, the clink of a spoon, the sound of the fridge door closing, because I was so acutely aware that at any moment, he might walk into the room. And when he did, it was as though my body registered it before my eyes did, a subtle tightening of my breath, the way my shoulders drew slightly inward. He didn't look at me directly. He moved around the kitchen with a kind of quiet care, as if too much noise might draw attention to what we'd done. I caught myself watching his hands as he rinsed a glass, and I hated that my mind wandered back to the feeling of those same hands on my shoulders. I busied myself with tasks that didn't need doing, wiping a countertop that was already clean, rearranging the tea bags in their box, anything to keep from thinking too much. Breakfast was quiet. He sat at the table, his fingers drumming lightly on the wood, and I could feel the weight of words he wasn't saying. I wanted to fill the silence, but every possible topic felt wrong. I reached for something mundane, the weather, the list of errands, but the words felt flat in my mouth. When I finally did speak, it sounded too casual, even to my own ears. "Did you sleep well?" He nodded, eyes fixed on his cup. "Yeah. You?" A meaningless exchange, but it felt like a negotiation. We were drawing lines with our words, deciding how much of yesterday would bleed into today. After breakfast, I tried to return to my routines. Laundry. Dishes. Small things that gave me the illusion of normalcy. But nothing felt normal. Every room I walked into carried a faint echo of that moment, like the air still remembered it. I found myself replaying it in my mind, unbidden, the hesitation, the lean, the kiss. I kept telling myself it had been nothing more than a slip, a mistake, a moment that didn't need to mean anything. But the more I repeated it, the less I believed it. At one point, I stepped outside to bring in the mail, and the cool air felt almost shocking against my skin. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the ground was soaked, and the smell of wet earth rose up around me. I lingered at the mailbox longer than necessary, clutching the envelopes like they might ground me. When I came back inside, he was standing at the window, watching the rain. He turned when he heard me, and for a second, we locked eyes. There was no hostility, no accusation, just that same quiet uncertainty that hung between us like a thread. Neither of us looked away immediately, but neither of us spoke either. As the day stretched on, the silence became something we both carried carefully. We weren't avoiding each other exactly, but we weren't seeking each other out either. It was as though we'd both silently agreed to orbit around the house without colliding. But there were moments. Small, fleeting moments where the distance slipped. When he reached for a bowl in the cabinet and his hand brushed mine. When we both bent to pick up the same dropped fork and our shoulders nearly touched. When I caught him glancing at me from across the room, his gaze darting away the second I noticed. These were the moments that unsettled me the most, not the kiss itself, but the quiet aftermath, the unspoken acknowledgement that something had changed. By mid-afternoon, the house felt stifling. I opened a window in the kitchen just to feel the damp breeze, and for a moment, I stood there, watching the water drip from the eaves. I thought about calling my husband, about hearing his voice, but the idea made my stomach twist. What would I say? Would he hear something in my tone, some fracture I couldn't hide? I didn't call. Instead, I sat in the living room with a book I didn't read, turning pages without seeing the words. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made me look up, and there he was, standing at the bottom, holding a stack of towels. "Thought I'd help with laundry," he said, his voice even. I nodded, forcing a smile that felt tight. "Thanks." He carried the towels into the laundry room, and I followed a few minutes later, as if drawn there by something I didn't want to name. He was folding the towels with careful precision, his head bent, and I watched him for a moment before stepping in to help. We worked in silence, the only sound the soft snap of fabric as we shook out each piece. Our arms brushed once, lightly, and neither of us moved away. When the last towel was folded, we both stood there for a moment longer than necessary, neither of us leaving the room. The silence felt loaded again, the same way it had the day before, the same way it had just before the kiss. But nothing happened. He cleared his throat, set the folded stack on the shelf, and stepped out. I stayed behind, my hands pressed flat against the cool surface of the washer, and tried to steady my breathing. That night, I lay in bed listening to the rain against the window, and the quiet of the house felt almost unbearable. I thought about the kiss again, the way it had felt like crossing a line we couldn't uncross. I told myself again that it had been a mistake. But lying there in the dark, I wasn't sure if I wanted it to stay just that. The next morning the rain had finally stopped, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than the storm itself. The air smelled clean, sharp, almost too clear, as if the downpour had stripped away something I wasn't ready to confront. The house was still, the kind of stillness that doesn't feel peaceful but waiting, as though every room was aware of the tension pressing against its walls. I woke early, long before I needed to, lying in bed with my hands folded over my stomach, staring at the ceiling and listening for the smallest sounds. When I heard footsteps in the hallway, his footsteps, my breath caught before I could stop it. The creak of the floorboards had become a strange kind of trigger. I noticed it every time he moved through the house, like my body had learned his presence more quickly than my mind could process it. Downstairs, I made coffee and tried to lose myself in the familiar ritual, grinding the beans, feeling the warmth of the cup in my hands. But my mind was scattered, distracted, my movements automatic. I barely tasted the coffee as I drank it. I barely noticed the morning news murmuring from the television. Everything in me felt taut, like a wire stretched too tight. He came into the kitchen not long after. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept much either. There was no eye contact at first, just a polite morning as he opened a cupboard and reached for a glass. I answered softly, my voice sounding thin to my own ears. Breakfast was quiet again, but not in the same way as yesterday. Yesterday had been silence built on avoidance, a desperate attempt to erase the kiss by pretending it had never happened. Today's silence felt different, almost deliberate, like we were both aware that pretending wasn't working anymore. I caught him glancing at me once, quickly looking away when our eyes met. That single glance felt louder than words, and I felt it like a weight in my chest. I wondered if he regretted it, the kiss, the closeness, all of it, and I hated that I couldn't tell. Later that morning, my phone rang. My husband's name flashed across the screen. I stared at it longer than I should have before answering. His voice on the other end was casual, familiar, the same steady tone I'd heard 1,000 times before. He told me he'd be gone for a few more days, longer than he'd expected, and I murmured an okay as if it meant nothing, though inside, I felt the ground shift again. I hung up and stood in the kitchen holding the phone, staring at the darkened screen. The silence that followed his call was louder than his voice had been. By midday, the sky had lightened, streaks of sunlight cutting across the floor through the windows. The house felt strangely bright, almost exposing. I decided to get out, to run a simple errand, to escape the walls closing in on me. I'm going to the store, I said, grabbing my keys from the counter. I'll come, he said without hesitation, and the words hung there between us. I didn't answer right away, but I didn't stop him either. The drive was short, just a few miles to the small grocery store in town, but the car felt unnervingly small. The radio played softly, some song neither of us really listened to. I focused on the road, my hands tight on the steering wheel, hyper-aware of him sitting in the passenger seat, of how close we were in that confined space. Inside the store, we moved together but apart. He pushed the cart while I chose items, and there was something almost painfully normal about it, two people shopping, talking quietly about which bread to buy, which apples looked best. But beneath that normalcy was something else, something unspoken threading through every interaction. At one point, as I reached for a jar on a high shelf, he stepped in behind me, his hand brushing mine as he helped. The touch was brief, almost nothing, but it sent a sharp awareness through me. I thanked him too quickly, my voice too light, and moved on. When we returned home, the bright afternoon light seemed harsher than before, illuminating every corner of the house. I unpacked the groceries, placing them methodically on the counters, but my mind wasn't on what I was doing. I heard him behind me, the faint scrape of a chair on the floor as he sat at the table. I could feel his eyes on me, though I didn't look back. The air between us felt thick, like it carried words we hadn't spoken yet. Eventually, I turned around, leaning back against the counter, arms crossed almost defensively. "This doesn't have to mean anything," I said, though my voice sounded uncertain even to me. He didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, his expression unreadable. Then he said softly, "Doesn't it?" The words landed heavier than I expected. The rest of the afternoon unfolded slowly. I busied myself with chores, wiping down surfaces, folding dish towels, but I wasn't really doing anything at all. Every time I passed him in the hallway, every time we ended up in the same room, there was that moment of stillness, that awareness of the space between us and what we'd done. By evening, the quiet had turned into something almost unbearable. I stood by the window, watching the last streaks of sunlight fade, and I thought about how far this had already gone. Not in actions, not yet, but in the way it occupied every corner of my thoughts. When I turned from the window, I saw him standing in the doorway. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. But the look in his eyes told me we both knew the pretending was almost over. The next day began with the same uneasy stillness that had settled over the house like an invisible layer. The rain had cleared entirely overnight, and sunlight streamed in through the windows, catching dust motes in its path and making everything look sharper, more defined. It should have made me feel better, lighter somehow, but instead it felt almost intrusive, like the light could see too much. I woke early again, though I'd slept even less. My mind had been restless all night, wandering over every glance, every word, every unspoken thing between us. Lying in bed, I'd heard the familiar creaks of the house, the kind I used to ignore, but now every noise seemed louder, every sound magnified by my nerves. I moved through my morning routine in a blur, making tea instead of coffee this time, folding the blanket on the sofa, opening the windows to air out the rooms. Each movement felt almost ceremonial, as if going through the motions could somehow bring things back to what they were before. But nothing felt before anymore. He came downstairs later, quieter than usual, his steps soft but deliberate. We greeted each other with a restrained morning, our voices careful, neither of us looking too long at the other. It struck me how quickly we had slipped into this strange choreography, measuring our movements, our words, everything calibrated to keep from tipping whatever balance we thought we still had. I tried to keep myself busy. I wiped down the counters again, even though they didn't need it. I reorganized the spice rack, something I hadn't touched in months. I kept my hands occupied so my thoughts wouldn't overwhelm me. But even as I moved through these tasks, I couldn't stop noticing him. The way he hovered nearby, always offering to help but never imposing. The way his gaze lingered when he thought I wasn't looking. The way the smallest interactions between us had taken on a weight I couldn't ignore. By the time afternoon rolled in, the air felt warmer, heavy with the promise of summer. I decided to open all the windows upstairs, hoping fresh air might clear my head. He followed me, carrying a stack of linens, and for a moment, it felt like nothing was wrong, just two people tending to a house. But every brush of his arm against mine, every shared glance in the narrow hallway, cracked that illusion. Later, I found myself in the living room again, the same room where everything had started. The sunlight had softened by then, the edges of the day beginning to blur. He came in, sat on the other side of the room, and for a while, we existed in silence, pretending to focus on other things. I felt the ache in my shoulders return, sharper than before, maybe from tension, maybe from the weight of everything unsaid. I tried to roll it out myself, but it only made it worse. He noticed almost immediately. "You're back again," he asked quietly. I nodded without looking at him. "It's fine," I said, though it wasn't. He stood, hesitated for a moment, then offered, I could help. Like before. I should have said no. Every part of me knew I should have. But instead, I simply said, okay. He moved behind me again, his hands tentative at first, pressing into the tightness of my shoulders. The familiarity of it startled me, the warmth of his touch, the quiet concentration in the way he worked. I stared at the floor, telling myself this was only to ease the pain, only a kindness. But it didn't stay that simple. His hands lingered a moment longer, pressed a little deeper, and I felt my breath change without meaning to. He noticed, I knew he noticed, but he didn't pull away. I turned my head slightly, maybe to say something, maybe just to breathe differently. And then, without planning it, without even thinking, we were leaning toward each other again. And we kissed. This time, it wasn't an accident disguised as hesitation. This time, neither of us stepped back immediately. The world outside felt impossibly distant, the hum of traffic far off, the occasional bird calling, all of it muffled by the pulse in my ears. When we finally broke apart, the room was so quiet I could hear the sound of my own breath. We didn't speak. He stepped back, his hands falling to his sides, and I stayed where I was, my fingers curled against the fabric of the sofa, as if holding on to something solid could steady me. The moment ended, but the weight of it didn't. I sat there long after he left the room, the sunlight dimming, shadows stretching across the floor, and I knew with absolute clarity, this wasn't something I could pretend away anymore. The morning after that second kiss felt like walking into a room where someone had just been arguing, not because there was shouting or broken glass, but because the air itself felt different, as if it had absorbed all the things no one dared to say. I woke before dawn again, my sleep fractured by dreams I couldn't remember, only the restless feeling they left behind. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, counting the tiny imperfections in the plaster, anything to stop my thoughts from looping back to the same moment. When I finally got up, the house was still dark, the kind of gray-blue half-light that makes everything look softer, almost fragile. I made coffee but didn't drink it right away, just let the steam curl up in front of me. I couldn't shake the image of yesterday, his hands on my shoulders, the quiet between us, the way we kissed and didn't immediately step away this time. The kiss itself had been brief, restrained, but it carried the unmistakable truth that we weren't pretending anymore. I caught myself wondering if he felt the same heavy swirl of thoughts, if he had tossed and turned all night like I did. A part of me wanted to go upstairs and ask, to cut through the silence with blunt honesty. Another part of me recoiled from that idea, because asking might make it real in a way we couldn't undo. By the time he came downstairs, the sun had fully risen, spilling a pale light across the kitchen floor. He looked tired, but there was something steadier in the way he carried himself, as if he'd made peace with something in his mind. He greeted me with the same careful morning, and I returned it, both of us pretending we didn't hear the tremor under those simple words. Breakfast passed almost wordlessly. We ate, we cleared dishes, we moved around each other in the small kitchen like people trying not to bump into each other in a crowded hallway. I found myself cataloging every detail, the way his sleeve brushed mine when he reached for the sugar, the way he avoided looking directly at me for too long, the way his silence felt both protective and suffocating. When the plates were stacked in the sink, I told myself I would focus on ordinary things, laundry, sweeping, folding the sheets that had been sitting in the basket for 2 days. But even as I moved through those tasks, my thoughts ran in circles. I noticed that I had started to change in small, almost invisible ways. I caught myself choosing clothes that weren't simply comfortable, but ones that made me feel seen. I brushed my hair and pinned it back with more care than usual, even though we weren't expecting visitors. These weren't conscious choices, not entirely, but I recognized them as soon as I made them. He had changed too. His movements around the house were more deliberate now, less hesitant. He offered help with small things, reaching a high shelf, carrying the basket of laundry, and when our hands brushed, neither of us flinched away. Those touches were brief, fleeting, but they lingered in my mind long after they ended. The hours stretched long that day, the way they do when you're waiting for something you can't name. I found myself listening for his footsteps, upstairs, in the hallway, down the stairs, as if their rhythm could tell me what he was thinking. At one point, I stood by the window, looking out at the backyard. The rain had left the grass a deeper shade of green, the air still holding that faint scent of earth. He came into the room quietly, standing a few feet away, and for a moment neither of us moved. It struck me then how far this had already gone, not in terms of what we had done, but in the way we inhabited the same space. Every glance, every pause, every wordless interaction had become something charged, something that pulled us closer even when we tried to keep our distance. I thought about calling my husband. The idea sat in my mind like a stone. I could hear the script already, asking how his trip was, listening to his answer, filling the silence with polite details about the house. But I didn't call. The thought of speaking to him with this weight in my chest felt impossible, like trying to balance on a tightrope while holding a secret you couldn't drop. By mid-afternoon, the sun had warmed the rooms, and the house felt oddly still. I was in the living room, folding a pile of laundry that didn't really need folding, when he came in carrying an empty glass. He set it on the table and didn't leave. He stood there for a moment, and I felt the silence deepen again, that same invisible pull that had been growing day by day. "We can't keep," I started, but the words didn't finish. He didn't answer, but his expression said everything. He knew what I meant, and he knew I didn't mean it fully. We didn't touch this time. We didn't kiss. But the awareness of what had happened, of what might happen, filled every inch of that room. By the evening, I felt a strange calm settle over me, not because anything had been resolved, but because I understood now that there was no going back to the way things were before. The tension wasn't an interruption anymore, it had become the air we breathed. I lay awake again that night, staring at the ceiling, hearing the faint creak of the house around me. Every sound seemed to carry a meaning now, every silence a weight. I didn't know what would happen next. But I knew this, whatever came, the line we had crossed wasn't something we could uncross. That night didn't feel like any of the nights before. The house was quiet, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that brings peace. It was a quiet that pressed on the walls, a quiet so dense I could almost hear my own pulse echoing in it. I tried to read in bed, but the words wouldn't stay in my head. I tried to scroll through my phone, but nothing on the screen could hold my attention. Every small thing felt amplified, the hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the creak of a step as the house settled, the distant sound of a car passing by on the empty road outside. I turned off the light and lay there in the dark, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling. My mind felt restless, tangled, unable to land on a single thought for more than a second before darting to another. I thought about my husband, far away, his voice earlier that day sounding casual, unbothered. I thought about how easily he'd said he'd be gone longer, how there'd been no hesitation in his tone. And I thought about what had been growing here in his absence. I didn't know when I fell asleep, only that I woke again sometime in the night. It wasn't a sharp awakening, not the kind that jolts you upright, but the kind where you simply open your eyes and know something feels different. The house was still, but not entirely. There was the softest creak in the hallway, the nearly imperceptible sound of movement outside my door. I didn't move at first. I just listened, every muscle in my body tense, as the door eased open, not a sudden push, but a slow, deliberate motion, as if whoever was opening it wasn't sure whether to step inside. And then he was there. He stood in the doorway for a moment, the faintest light from the hallway behind him outlining his shape. He didn't speak, and neither did I. My breath caught, but I didn't tell him to leave. I didn't even ask why he'd come. He stepped inside. The sound of his footsteps was almost non-existent, but I felt every one of them. He stopped near the bed, and for a long moment we just looked at each other. It wasn't a stare that demanded answers, not a confrontation, but something softer and more fragile, like we were both waiting for the other to shatter the silence first. I didn't. Neither did he. But the silence broke anyway, in the only way it could. We didn't speak, didn't fill the air with explanations we didn't have. We just let the night take us to the place we'd been circling for days, the line we'd crossed twice already now fully behind us. We spent the night together. Afterward, the quiet felt even heavier. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment before standing, moving back toward the door. I watched him go, the soft click of the latch the only sound in the room. I lay there, awake long after he left, my body still, my mind loud. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on me, but not with shock. Not with surprise. Because I had known this was coming. Every glance, every touch, every pause that lingered too long, each one had been pointing to this night. And now it was no longer a question of if. It was only a question of what would come next. The morning after that night felt strange in a way I couldn't quite name. The world outside the window looked the same, a soft light over the yard, birds cutting through the quiet, but everything in me felt unsettled, as if the axis of my life had tilted ever so slightly. I woke before the alarm, my eyes opening to the thin gray light just before dawn, and for a moment I lay perfectly still, listening to the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence that used to greet me on early mornings, but a silence that carried weight, that seemed to demand I face it. The bed felt colder, the empty space beside me an echo of what had happened only hours before. My mind replayed the night in fragments, not vivid images, but sensations, the way he had stood in the doorway for that first long moment, the way the air had seemed to stop moving when neither of us spoke, the quiet after we had crossed that line. That line, the one we'd been circling, avoiding, pretending we hadn't already stepped over, was gone now. I got up slowly, every movement deliberate, as if rushing might shatter the thin layer of composure I was clinging to. My hands shook slightly as I made coffee, though I tried to blame it on the chill of the kitchen. I stared into the mug as steam curled upward, pretending I could lose myself in something as ordinary as that rising warmth. He didn't come downstairs right away. I had time to finish half the cup before I heard footsteps above me, slow, almost cautious, the weight of each step measured. When he finally appeared, he didn't meet my eyes at first. He moved toward the counter, reached for a glass of water, as if that simple act might fill the space between us. I murmured a morning, my voice quiet but steady, and he echoed it back in a tone that felt both familiar and completely altered. Breakfast was awkward. There was no other word for it. We sat across from each other, and every clink of a fork, every scrape of a chair sounded too loud in the stillness. Neither of us brought up the night before, not in words, not even in hints, but it was there, woven into every gesture. At one point, I reached for the sugar and my hand trembled, just slightly, enough for him to notice. He didn't comment, but I saw the flicker of recognition in his expression. When breakfast was over, we cleared the plates in silence. It was the kind of silence that felt fragile, like glass that might crack with the wrong word. I tried to throw myself into chores, thinking the routine might calm me. I started a load of laundry, wiped down the kitchen counters again, even opened the windows to let in the sharp, early spring air. But the ordinary things felt hollow. Every room in the house felt different now, not in how they looked, but in what they held. The living room where he had first touched my shoulders, the hallway where our hands had brushed, the staircase that creaked beneath his feet, all of them seemed to remember. I thought about my husband. I tried not to, but his absence was a constant presence in itself. He had no idea. He was somewhere far away, probably sitting in a hotel room or a meeting, his voice from yesterday still in my head, calm, steady, trusting. That trust felt heavy now, like something I was carrying but couldn't put down. By midday, the sun had shifted, filling the rooms with a light that felt harsher, too revealing. I made tea and sat at the table, staring out the window at the yard. He walked in, and for a long moment we didn't speak. He sat down across from me, his hands wrapped around a glass of water, and we just looked at each other. Not for long, not enough for it to feel like a confrontation, but enough for the weight of everything unsaid to press between us. Finally, he said quietly, "Are you okay?" I nodded, even though I wasn't. He didn't push, and I didn't explain. The rest of the afternoon passed in a strange haze. He stayed close, but not too close. We moved around each other carefully, as if we were both afraid to bump into something fragile and break it. By evening, I felt exhausted, not from anything I'd done, but from the constant, heavy awareness of it all. When I went upstairs, the air felt heavier, the walls closer. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my hands in my lap. That night had changed something. I couldn't pretend otherwise, not to him, not to myself. And I knew the weight of it wasn't going away. The next morning the weight of what had happened clung to me before I even opened my eyes. It was as if my body woke up before my mind, carrying the heaviness of the night we'd already left behind. The air in the room felt different, thicker somehow, charged, like it had absorbed too much. The light coming through the curtains was brighter than it had been in days, but it didn't feel like comfort. It felt like exposure. I lay there for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, the memories of the last few days looping through my mind. Each kiss. Every unspoken word. The night that had rewritten everything. It wasn't just guilt that sat in my chest, it was a complicated mix of things I didn't even have names for. Regret, maybe. Longing, too. Something in between. I finally pushed the covers back and got up, moving through the motions of the morning like someone acting out a part. I showered, dressed, made coffee, all the things I always did, but the sense of routine was gone. Every action felt loaded, as though I was doing it while carrying a secret too large to keep hidden. He came downstairs while I was standing at the sink, staring out the window, my hands wrapped around the warm coffee mug like I needed it to anchor me. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, almost hesitant, but he didn't stop at the doorway this time. He walked into the kitchen, stood a few feet away, and greeted me softly. "Morning," I said back, and even that single word felt too loud in the quiet of the house. We moved through breakfast quietly, the sound of utensils and glasses louder than any conversation we didn't have. Neither of us mentioned the night. Neither of us even hinted at it. But it was there, saturating every second, every glance, every pause. At one point, my phone buzzed on the table, and his eyes flicked toward it. My husband's name glowed on the screen. The sight of it made my stomach tighten. I answered, keeping my voice even. He asked about the house, about the weather, about little things he probably didn't even really hear the answers to. His tone was calm, warm, familiar, completely unaware. I hung up the phone feeling a strange hollowness, like I'd just lied without speaking a single false word. He didn't say anything about the call, and I didn't bring it up. The day dragged on slowly, each hour stretched thin. I threw myself into chores again, laundry, dishes, tidying rooms that didn't need tidying, but nothing eased the heaviness. The house felt too quiet, every sound amplified, the hum of the fridge, the creak of the stairs, the sound of him walking from one room to another. There were moments when we crossed paths and spoke about nothing, what to cook for lunch, whether we had enough bread, but even those words carried an undercurrent neither of us addressed. Around mid-afternoon, I heard a car in the driveway. The sound made my breath stop for a beat. When the front door opened, it was my husband's voice that filled the house, calling out a simple, familiar hello. He was back. Earlier than expected. The sound of him dropping his bag in the hallway, the click of his shoes on the floor, it all felt surreal, like I was hearing it from far away. I stood in the kitchen, my hands frozen on the edge of the counter. When he walked in, he smiled the way he always did when he came home, tired but warm, his face open and unknowing. He kissed my cheek, casually, like always, and asked if I'd missed him. I smiled back, the muscles of my face moving as if on their own, and said of course, but the words felt strange in my mouth. Behind him, I saw movement, a glimpse of the one person who knew everything. He stood just far enough away, his face unreadable, and in that split second our eyes met. The air seemed to thicken. There we were, the three of us, standing in the same space, pretending nothing had changed, when everything had. The rest of the afternoon was like walking on thin glass. My husband unpacked his bag, talked about his trip, about the meetings, about the places he'd been. His voice filled the house, but every word seemed to ring against the silence I was holding inside. I moved through the motions, setting the table, pouring drinks, nodding at the right times, while my mind raced. Every time my eyes met his, every time our hands brushed in the kitchen, I felt the truth sitting in my chest like a stone. And every time I glanced up and saw the other pair of eyes across the room, the ones that had seen me differently now, the weight of it deepened. That night, we sat at the table for dinner, the three of us, and nothing looked unusual to anyone else. But to me, every single thing had changed. Dinner that night was a study in restraint. Every movement, every word, every glance felt weighted with a pressure that none of us acknowledged, though it was sitting there at the table just as surely as we were. The plates were set neatly, the food steaming gently between us, but the tension hung over it all like a storm cloud that hadn't broken yet. My husband spoke first, his voice carrying the same steady warmth I'd always known, telling stories about his trip, the meetings that ran too long, the hotel that had smelled faintly of cigarette smoke despite its promises otherwise, the strange meal he'd eaten in a restaurant he couldn't even name. I nodded and smiled when I was supposed to, asked small questions that kept his stories flowing. But inside, my mind was in two places at once, here at this table and somewhere else entirely. Across from me, his nephew sat quietly. He didn't add much to the conversation, didn't try to draw attention to himself. But every so often, our eyes would meet for the briefest second, and in those tiny flashes, there was a current of everything we weren't saying. I watched his hands as he cut into his food, steady, careful, and thought about how those same hands had been on my shoulders, had pressed into the knots in my back, had rested in places I couldn't even let myself think about now. I felt my chest tighten and forced myself to look away, to focus instead on the clink of a fork against a plate, on my husband's voice filling the space. After dinner, we all moved through the motions of clearing the table, rinsing dishes, putting leftovers into containers. It should have felt ordinary. It didn't. Each step was too deliberate, too quiet. The sound of water running in the sink felt sharp, almost intrusive, against the silence that kept creeping back between sentences. My husband talked about his plans for the coming week, who he had to call, which appointments he'd already rescheduled. His words were so normal, so everyday, that they almost sounded strange in this house where nothing felt normal anymore. When the dishes were stacked neatly in the drying rack, he excused himself to unpack his bag, his footsteps fading up the stairs. And then, for a moment, there was just the two of us again. The silence was instant and heavy. He stood by the counter, not looking directly at me, and I stood near the table, my hands still damp from drying the last plate. Neither of us spoke. It struck me then how much had shifted in so little time, how the person standing across from me wasn't just someone who'd come to stay for a few days, wasn't just a houseguest anymore. He was a witness now, and I was too. I thought about everything that had led us here, the first time he'd offered to massage my shoulders, his hands trembling, the first kiss, quick and unexpected, the second kiss, less hesitant, the night when neither of us stepped away. Every one of those moments stacked in my mind like a line of stones, each one heavier than the last. I thought about my husband upstairs. I could picture him unzipping his suitcase, laying out his clothes, humming quietly under his breath. I thought about how much he didn't know, and how much I couldn't tell him. The quiet stretched long enough that I finally broke it, though I didn't mean to. My voice sounded unfamiliar when I said, "We can't," but the rest of the words didn't come. He looked at me then, finally, and there was something in his eyes I couldn't read, a mix of guilt, maybe, and something softer, something like resolve. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. I turned away first, not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't stand there any longer under the weight of it all. Later that evening, we all sat in the living room for a while, the three of us together, the television flickering in front of us. My husband leaned back into the couch, relaxed in a way he always was when he came home, his voice casual when he commented on the news, when he asked if anyone wanted more tea. I sat next to him, nodding, speaking when I needed to, but my thoughts were far from that couch. When it grew late, the night settled over the house in that slow, steady way it does, shadows deepening, the rooms growing quieter, one by one. We all went upstairs, each to our own room, the sound of doors closing softly. In my room, I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, my hands resting loosely in my lap. I could hear faint sounds through the walls, my husband moving around in the next room, drawers opening and closing, and farther away, almost inaudible, the sound of another door shutting gently. I thought about everything that had happened. Everything we had done. Everything we hadn't said. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that seemed to breathe. It was over, at least for now, the words, the gestures, the moments we'd let happen. But it didn't feel finished. It felt like the pause between sentences. Like something that had been said too softly to hear, but couldn't be unsaid.
Bye.